Good afternoon, my friends and followers. I'm your lawyer, Patrick McGeehan, and I am your best friend at your worst time. Here is a question I literally get all the time in my personal injury cases. I do mainly personal injury cases that I'm involved in are mainly death cases and significant serious bodily injury cases, all rising out of accidents between cars, trucks, pedestrians, motorcycles, the whole nine yards, mostly accidents. I don't do slip and falls or anything like that. I do strictly accidents. So, how do you get $1 million out of your accident case? Well, I'm going to tell you, you're going to need three things. I'm going to tell you what those three things are, and I'm going to explain them to you. But first, let's talk about $1 million. You see these billboards all over the place. Joe got me $500,000. Joe got me $1 million. Joe got me $800,000. Whatever. Well, you have to know what the injuries are in relation to that. Nowadays, $1 million may not cover you or compensate you for your injuries in a particular accident. For example, if you're in your 20s and you get in an accident and you can't work anymore and you're going to need medical care or medical treatment for the rest of your life, $1 million may not cut it. A case I'm involved in involved a professional who made a lot of money. She was fairly young. She was getting in an Uber, and just as she was getting in the Uber got rear-ended by a drunk driver, and it caused her a traumatic brain injury. $1 million in coverage is not going to compensate her for those injuries. Eventually, that money is going to run out. And I see a lot of those cases. A lot of cases where there's catastrophic injuries and there's low insurance policies, there's low limits on the insurance policies. Um, it's a terrible situation, but it's the reality of the life and the reality of the type of cases. A lot of times you can get cases settled. The problem you have with cases that are difficult to settle is when they're not clear cut. If you have a case where you're sitting at a red light and you get waffled by a UPS truck, or you're crossing the street at a crosswalk and you get hit by the FedEx truck, or you're driving down the road and a wheel comes off a big commercial truck and hits your vehicle and causes the accident, that's very different from the cases where it's questionable about maybe somebody was speeding, maybe somebody changed lanes, when there's some discrepancy about who's at fault in the accident is where the problem comes in. That's why injury lawyers like big truck cases because there's usually lots of insurance. In trucking cases, there's usually significant injuries. So it all comes together. The three things that you absolutely have to have in your injury case to collect $1 million or more, and sometimes even less, is you have to have sufficient insurance coverage. If you don't have sufficient insurance coverage, you're going to end up being out of gas. There are a whole lot of cases I see where people are carrying the minimum Florida required insurance, which is 10,000, 20,000, 10,000 per accident, or 10,000 per person, $20,000 per accident. And those are the maximums on it. So if you have a significant injury, there is no way that $10,000 is going to cover you. Sure, you could sue the person individually above that 10,000. What do most people have? Most people don't have enough to compensate in personal assets to compensate you. Now, you get hit by Warren Buffett, that's a different story. But if you get hit by Joe Schmo on the street, he usually doesn't have the type of assets which would cover a catastrophic injury like that. And another thing you have to have is you have to have the liability and the causation. The other person has to be more at fault or a percentage more at fault that would make up that type of dollar amount settlement. For example, if you again take the example, you're sitting at an intersection at a red light and you get hit in the rear end by the UPS truck and you get significant injuries. If the light's red, you're sitting there stopped and there's nothing you could do. You didn't even know the guy hit you until he hit you. 100% causation on the UPS truck. You can collect 100% of available insurance in relationship to your injury. Okay. If there's a question, say you're driving down I-95 and a car changes lanes or you change lanes or some type of lane change occurs where it can't be determined who's at fault or the percentages are different, or if you're found to be 25% at fault and the other driver is found to be 75% at fault, you're going to get 75% of whatever that jury values or whatever it's determined the value of those injuries are. So you have to have sufficient insurance to cover your injuries. A lot of people don't carry $1 million policies. I'm telling you that right now. That's why attorneys, injury attorneys, love these trucking accidents because the truck has insurance, the driver has insurance, the trailer has insurance, and the cargo usually has insurance. So you usually have a lot of coverage there. So we've already covered the liability and causation aspect. You have to have sufficient insurance to cover the injuries, and you have to have the injuries. To make $1 million in a personal injury case or more, you have to have $1 million worth of injuries. So how is that determined? Well, if you go to trial, it's determined by a jury and you have expert witnesses testify to it. If it settles before trial, you have to have some evidence that you can present to the insurance company, which will push them to settle the case. Usually, have an economist and medical personnel look at it and come to an opinion about the dollar amount or the value of those injuries. And if you get all three of those together, you can collect $1 million or more. If you're missing any one of them, you cannot. The ones that are usually missing, well, they can all three be missing, but the ones that I see that are usually missing are sufficient insurance coverage. So to recap, you need causation and liability, less for you, more for the other person, hopefully 100% for the other person. You need the insurance coverage, a sufficient amount of insurance to cover your injuries. And you need injuries which equate to that dollar amount of $1 million or more. Like I said, if you're missing either one of them, you're out of gas. You're not going to collect. You may have an injury where you have a traumatic brain injury or you got your leg ripped off in a motorcycle accident, you lost your leg or whatever, and the other side only has a 10/20 policy and they're 100% at fault. You're never going to see a sufficient amount of recovery to compensate you for those injuries. So just keep that in mind when you're seeking out an injury lawyer. A lot of times in the beginning of the case, particularly for the first week or so, you don't know what the coverage is. Sometimes you do because they actually have proof of coverage. Um, if it's a major commercial carrier, you could pretty much bet they're going to have at least $1 million worth of coverage, a lot of times more. I've seen cases which go up to 10 million and even more. Um, it just depends on what it is, and that's why your attorney does investigations. That's why we do investigations. I actually go out to the scene of these crashes along with my expert and view the evidence in the scene for myself as he collects the evidence. So if you have any questions about that, about personal injury cases, please let me know either in the comments or you can contact me directly on any of the socials. And remember, if you like this type of content, you find it helpful, please like and subscribe.